Hi, I'm Melissa Reader. Welcome to Agehood, the podcast for people who are quietly carrying it all. Aging parents, adult kids, work, life, love, and their own next chapter. If this is sounding like you, well, you're in your agehood, and it's time we talked about it. As we're learning through this podcast, the last chapters of life and death are a process, but they're ones that we really rarely talk about until it's too late. But that's something that my guest today is hoping to change. Dr Hannah Gould is a cultural anthropologist working in the areas of religion, technology and death. Through her work at the University of Melbourne's Death Tech Research Network, she's exploring how we mourn, how we memorialise and how we make meaning, especially in an increasingly digital and secular world. Hannah wants us to get better at death as individuals, within our families and as a society. And in this episode of Agehood, Hannah's joining me in the studio to talk about losing her own father at 23, the strange comfort of academic frameworks, and why we urgently need to rethink how we support the sandwich generation, starting with something as simple and maybe as overdue as extending bereavement leave. We also talk about why our funerals now feature so many PowerPoint slideshows and bad party pies. And yes, how Australia has exported that to the world. If you've ever wondered what a good death looks like or whether we're all doing grief wrong, this one's for you. Dr Hannah Gould, welcome to Agehood. Dr Hannah Gould, welcome to Agehood. It is really lovely to have you here. Your work has been so fascinating, and I've been following your work for the last couple of years. So let me see if I get this right. As an anthropologist and research fellow at the Death Tech Research Network at the University of Melbourne. Yep. So you're looking at how death and memorialisation and mourning practices are evolving in this ever-changing world, particularly this kind of increasingly digital world. Yep. So I'm really looking forward to unpacking that with you and thinking about how our relationship with the last chapter of life and death and grief and loss is changing, and some of the emerging rituals and trends that you're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, you use the word evolving, and I think, we use the word evolving as well, but it's not always good. It's not always good, it's not always bad, and perhaps sometimes it's not something that can be measured on that scale of morality. A lot of new technologies and trends and rituals are emerging, and people will have a bit of a play, a bit of experiment with them, and then maybe we decide they're not for us. We decide to do death in different ways. And sometimes that can be just, resurrecting old technologies as well, which is really interesting. So it's been a fascinating space to be a part of.
So much to talk about. But let's start with you. Tell me a little bit about, what drew you to this
what am
work?
I doing? Yeah.
Where did that come up for you, and what were the decisions or the life experiences that brought you into this area, this part of research?
Yeah, so I mean, I didn't really intend at all to set off to be like, I'm going to have a career researching death. I was an undergraduate anthropologist and really, really interested in religion, really interested in the kind of things that people hold as sacred, right? Like, and kind of what that was, how it was that like an object could become more than an object, that it could become imbued with the spirit of a god or somebody's memory, right? And that could be something similar, as simple as like an heirloom that you have that reminds you of someone who's died, and you can't possibly throw it out, even though you logically know it's not them and, they're not connected to it. And as often happens when you're like researching this area, the personal kind of combines with the professional. Yeah. And I was in my honours year in just finishing up my undergraduate, and my dad died. And I was 23 at the time, which at the time felt very mature.
Of course.
It was like,
we all think we're...
I was like, well,
we're so clever and so wise.
I'm so clever.
Worldly,
and
23.
Also, this is the oldest I've ever been. Yeah. So how could I ever think I would be young? I felt, like, of course I'm able to handle this. But, a decade and a half later, looking back onto it, is is obviously a very shockingly young age to lose your parent. And I think my dad and I had this like very close relationship as well. Like, you know, real daddy's girl. Like this was kind of really important personal relationship for me. And I suppose, you know, most people would potentially be expected to kind of therefore not look into death and dying much after that. But there's a tendency, whether or not it's good or bad in academia, to kind of study that which you do not understand. So that really led me to study, think, you know, critically and start researching about death and dying and what are the things that we leave behind and how do we, use particularly objects and material culture to connect with the dead.
Wow, I have so many questions.
Yeah.
Just off that little introduction. Do you think that your work has helped you process that loss, that even that experience as part of your life? Do you think it's been a way to process it or make sense of it?
Yeah, I think in some degree. I actually think that the analytical side of my brain has really helped from having that kind of scaffolding. It helps make things be put into sense.
Yeah.
You know, things that you experience that you go, oh, that's quite normal for Australian death care, or
I have a framework for that.
Yeah, I have a framework for
Yes.
that. Or, oh, okay, here's a model. You know, academics love a good model. But I'm not sure that you can intellectualize grief to that extent. And I think many academics try to do so and intellectualize emotions. And it's not always successful, and it never really is successful. At the end of the day, I think it breaks down. So, I think more of the emotional work has had to be done alongside that.
Yeah, of course.
But
There's
also,
no perfect methodology for grief.
No,
right?
and also I think if nothing else, though, being kind of as an anthropologist looking not just at my own society but looking around the world at the diversity of all of the different ways in which people do death, they do grief very, very differently, and none of them are right or wrong. Like you can't point to like X culture or X historical moment in which we've solved death. Like you just don't solve it. You don't make it better. You don't fix it. And I think that has been very comforting. If nothing else, it's like, you know what? Humanity does this really, really, really differently, and there's no one golden rule.
Well, that is one of the things I was very keen to talk to you about. So let's just
Jump in.
go there.
Sorry, yeah.
What do you see in your work around different rituals, different practices, different beliefs in different cultures or traditions that strike you in a different way, whether they're different or they're meaningful in it? Like, what would you share when you think about different cultures?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it's not just cross-culturally, but it's also within our own culture. So I was thinking the other day about Victorian mourning era, right? So we think about Queen Victoria losing her husband Albert, adopting black dress, wearing black for hundreds and hundreds of days, you know, until the end of her life, never really coming out of formal mourning, right? And that was a period in English history and Australian European history in which, you know, mourning or like public grief was beginning to be kind of criticised and disappear from public spaces. So we used to have these like really big processions, right? Victorian elaborate mourning culture is big processions of people through the streets with the carriages and the hearse and everything else. I think the image I always think of is like the funeral of the suffragettes, for example. You could see those women all together walking through the streets, but, you know, of a trade unionist, of a politician, of whoever it is. And then grief kind of disappeared from the public view for a really long time and became this more private thing. And then perhaps, I suppose now with the internet and public mourning and social media, are we seeing it reemerge, right, as this kind of public act and public space and that sort of thing?
And we've had some very public, high-profile deaths, haven't we, in the last couple of years?
Yeah.
We've had the Queen, we've very recently had the Pope, and there's just such an outpouring and almost like a spectacle of those events.
So death studies scholars in the West will tend to point to Princess Diana as like this turning point for public grief. And I think it was because her life was so hyper-mediatized. Like she was in magazines, she was on TV, she was everywhere. I mean,
she fed. And
it
sadly,
arguably caused, led to her death as well. Yeah. And so people had the capacity, therefore, to form a parasocial relationship with her, to feel like, I knew her personally, even if that was a media presentation, right? And so then when that person dies, you grieve them personally. And I think that's quite common these days, you say, with the Queen, with the Pope. But I think, when I teach death and dying, I always ask my students this, like, who was it for you? Because I think everyone usually has, like, their celebrity who that really hit home
What
for
do
them.
they tell you?
Oh, well,
what are the most common answers to that?
They're all young.
That's why I'm asking. I'm fascinated.
A lot of them I'm like, I don't know who that is. Actually, a lot of them, the singer from One Direction.
Oh, yeah, right.
Liam, when he died, that was a big kind of touch point. I think it was because that's like a pop star, an uber pop star from their childhood.
And Heath Ledger's death might have been a bit too
I think it's quite generational, and it's quite. It also can be quite specific to the type of media, type of person. You are, like, for my mum, I was just asking my mum the other day, and she was saying, it was the founder of the Body Shop, Roderick, and it was just like, this was the person that I really mourned. I really looked up to her. Anita Roderick, I think her name is, and then when she died,
it was, yeah.
that was really mournful. And I think for me, it was Anthony Bourdain, because that was somebody that I really looked up to, and watched his media and appreciated. So it is this kind of thing, all of which is to say that even within our own culture, like how we're supposed to do death, how we're supposed to do grief, you think it's hyper-personal and think it's like this psychological internal process that no one understands. Actually, it's like really cultural. It's really determined by what our society thinks is good grief or bad grief or proper, or what time you're supposed to do it, how long it's supposed to last, how quickly you're supposed to get out of it. Are you supposed to wear black? You're not supposed to wear black. All of these things that I think we tend to assume are individual or emotional turn out to be cultural and social. I mean, that's like a classic anthropologist answer.
It is, isn't it?
But it is that kind of, that is what fascinates me, is that these kind of forces that we didn't really understand are governing our lives in that way, lives and deaths.
You explored some of these themes in a series recently on SBS with Ray Martin.
Yes.
It was so great to see you as part of that. I think it was called The Last Goodbye. What did you learn during that? Or what surprised you? Because, I mean, it was just brilliant to see someone with Ray Martin's profile step into this space, and I think about what that last goodbye means, and particularly in the context of an ageing population, which he is part of. How did that go?
I think exactly. I think the initial kind of idea for the series was that Ray had just hit the average age of mortality for Australian men. And I think for him himself, that was quite confronting. Like, he hadn't really thought about death and his own death. It was always something far in the future, despite being, late 70s, early 80s. I won't give it away. And as someone who thinks about death all the time, that's always quite interesting to see somebody, I suppose, like, come to those realizations and have those moments of like, there will be a body to handle that someone has to make a decision about. Or, oh gosh, like, there will probably be a funeral. Like, they will probably try and do a funeral for me. And in the case of Ray, it's like, well, they'll probably try and do a public, a state funeral for you. Are you comfortable with that? Are you not? You get to make those decisions. And then I suppose also him coming to that and actually finding that the available options, or what he thought was kind of the way things should go, were not so satisfactory, that he wanted to do something different, and wanted to do something more creative or experimental, and which is totally possible, but he just needed to give that a bit of thought.
Which is the bit we don't do.
I mean,
quite often.
We do it too late. And I think that's probably the most frustrating thing when I'm talking to people, is not that what they want isn't possible, it's just that they need to kind of put their hand up and ask for it or demand for it and make those decisions. Yeah.
It's this almost perpetual problem of too little too late, whether that's about your healthcare wishes and preferences, or it's your financial and legal matters.
Oh, yeah.
Or your memory and legacy, or just your preparation for that life chapter. Even people who I have interviewed who might arrive at the interview and say, well, I'm actually a really organised person, so you're probably not going to learn very much from me, but I say, let's have a chat anyway. Yeah. And so many times they might have a will and a power of attorney in place, which is great, because not enough people do. But then they'll say, I've never thought about my healthcare preferences. Wow, okay. So now I'm not as organised as I thought I was going to be. So a big part of what we're trying to do is open those conversations and help people think about a meaningful plan for really all aspects of that chapter of life. And some of those aspects are going to be more or less important to certain people and their families.
Yeah.
But they're all part of that stage of life.
I mean, it's hilarious the number of like death study scholars, professors of death and dying in religion who do not have a will, do not have a medical power of attorney, don't have an advanced care directive.
Like the plumber with the leaky tap.
Yeah, like the plumber with the leaky tap, like the doctor who smokes. Like they often have quite strong kind of inclinations about what they want or do not want. Like I have a mentor colleague of mine who the other day came out and was like, well, I don't want a funeral. And I was like, well, this is the first we're hearing of this. And we all were planning, if you were to die, we were going to give you one. So, this might be a good place to start the conversation. But I mean, that is how the nature of taboos work. A taboo is uncomfortable, not just because it's distasteful or scary, but the way that taboo works actually is that you're afraid of it because some part of you believes that talking about it or thinking about it will bring it into being. It's like a supernatural force.
Superstitious, almost.
Superstitious. And a little bit of a story, but English gets the word taboo via Captain Cook.
Really?
Yeah,
tell us about that. I don't know that. That's interesting.
The term taboo comes into the English language through the Voyages of Captain Cook, this journal, and I believe he was in the Pacific Islands, and it's a Pacific Islander term, I believe Samoan or Hawaiian or something, tabu, taboo, which in that society was something which was like if you broke this rule, then a god, a supernatural force would come down and punish you. But that is the original meaning of it, right? And so when we say like, oh, death is taboo, it's not just that it makes us uncomfortable. It's like, well, I wouldn't want to say that just in case
there's a consequence.
It makes it bring it ahead forward. Yeah.
That's so interesting. I love the etymology of language, and there's so much to learn in that. I mean, do you think about other societal taboos, particularly as women? I think mental health had a heavy layer of stigma and taboo, and we've made great progress there. But even think about what's happening in recent years with menopause and miscarriage. We weren't talking about those topics just a handful of years ago, and suddenly we are. They're in the zeitgeist.
Oh, and this is it. It's like change is possible. And in fact, I think that's one of the key messages from studying death and dying is that, if people assume that death is personal, they also assume that it's traditional, that it's unending, right? That like, wow, I just do what my grandparents did and they just did what their parents did. But, one generation ago, we were all being buried, not cremated.
Yeah.
Like massive change in our death care system is possible. A couple of generations ago, we were all dying at home. We weren't dying in hospital or aged care. Yeah. Death and dying and aging really change. And the good thing about that is that we can therefore change them for the better, right? These are not immutable truths. We can make some headway to make them better.
Really?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's a very obvious parallel to draw, but
massive parallel.
It's an easy one to understand. Like my mum gave birth to me in stirrups under fluorescent lights in the 70s.
Yep.
Poor mum.
Yeah. And
my births with my kids, and mine were by no means highly unusual, but they were much calmer, gentler water births,
And I think the gendered element is also really important there, right? So in the same way we look at the kind of over-medicalisation of the birthing process that took power and authority out of women's hands and into the medical profession, many of whom are women today, death and dying have kind of gone through a similar process where like death and dying have been hyper-medicalised, right?
Yeah.
And so now there is this kind of great paradox of death in the 21st century, which is that we have all of these technologies available to us, but it doesn't necessarily mean that death is better.
Well, technology can sustain life, but it can't restore health.
Yeah.
So that's the paradox, I think, isn't it? That you have this really tragic situation happening really sadly, very commonly, where very elderly, frail people who haven't had those conversations and made those plans with their families have a fall, have an infection, all of those things that we know are signs of, someone's decline, and they end up in acute care settings, and then they, one of our clinical advisors calls this the kind of the conveyor belt almost. You keep going in, you keep having the next thing treated, but nobody's really, not enough people are sitting back and thinking this is a whole person who is increasingly frail and now in the last chapter of their life. And how do we think about and talk about that differently?
And the challenge for that as well is also on the other side. So part of the work that I do is I teach, I design this course and teach a course for medical students at Melbourne Uni. Yeah, so it's a course that we've taught for about 3 or 4 years now. It's an elective for the first year medical students, and it's just like death and dying 101. And it's been great, like a surprising uptake of students. They had lots of different options, and perhaps, unsurprisingly, perhaps the two most popular options were medicine about sex and medicine about death. But we got a huge number of enrollments, and the students are really fascinated by it.
Is that about communication about death, or like what do you cover in that? Because I've heard often that we don't do enough in medicine, and people learn by life experience and by great role models.
Or unfortunately, we chuck them into hospitals on their first rotation and someone dies in front of them and they're ill prepared to handle it, right? Or they're in an observation in a GP's office and the GP is delivering, terminal news and they get they're unsupported and they're shocked by that. So, I mean, I have a lot of compassion for how medical doctors are trained like that. A lot of them are very bad at talking about death, but that's because no one's told them how to talk about it.
It's not an easy thing to do.
And it's not an easy thing to do. So that course is really broad. It's everything from, debates about where people should die, voluntary euthanasia, debates about, we even go through like funerals, different cultural and religious customs in Australia, cremation versus burial, should you go to a patient's funeral, all these kind of questions. But then it does focus on communication, right? So how do you tell somebody that we think you're going to die, right? And talking about using the D word and making sure that people understand. Because we have very good evidence that patients really want clarity.
Absolutely.
Like it's the number thing they want.
You can imagine how hard it is for that clinician too when they've got really full waiting rooms, very distressed families in
15-minute GP appointment.
In a 15-minute block. That's right. So I am not suggesting for a second that this should be easy or it's really complex work. But you're right. I mean, all the evidence says people want that clarity. They want it delivered to them in a gentle, appropriately paced way.
But it's part of the challenge that, in the medicalisation of death, as with the medicalisation of childbirth, a conversation that probably would have happened with your priest has become a conversation that's happening with your doctor, right? So it's like all of a sudden this specialist or GP is being vested the power to tell you, we think you're going to die. This is when we think you're going to die and where and what's that going to look like. And this is what we're going to help you with these medications or these supports. This is what it's going to look like. But that's not a conversation that medical professionals, historically, if you take a long view, this is not a conversation that medical professionals have always been a part of. Like it is a kind of quite recent development that medicine has taken over death to be the primary authority on death. And I think, maybe it is part of solving that equation is getting back that multidisciplinary team, right, and seeing more of a role for things like chaplaincy, but also spiritual care advisors. And, certainly I think it's no surprise to know that nurses are often much better at these conversations than doctors.
Yeah, I hear that all the time too. And also, and I think this is, what I've been learning through this work over the last couple of years is people are often thinking about mum being well and shopping today or mum being dead. And there's not enough in between around this is a stage of life where mum is in her late 80s, her early 90s. Things are going to start to look different. Like they're developmental milestones in reverse. So there's a whole physiology there that we can use to make sense of it, but we don't talk about that as a life stage.
So one of the most interesting statistics is the distinction between life expectancy and healthy life expectancy. So like life expectancy in Australia for someone born today, they can expect to live 83 point something years.
We just had Bernard Salt in here, so
right.
yes,
there
we're all across
83 point something years, that's the
yes.
life expectancy. But healthy life expectancy is something like 70 point something years for the WHO, like around the world.
70, not 70 something, just 70.
Just 70, right?
Yeah.
And so what that basically means is that all of us can expect to have, 10 plus years of infirmity at the end of our lives, if we're lucky, right? If we're lucky, best case scenario, we make it to old age, right? And I think that is the other thing that's really changed about death and dying, that is part of this bigger demographic change, right? Is that it's kind of extraordinary. Actually, I think we don't celebrate it enough, and I think it's kind of amazing. But like death is primarily a function of old age in Australia. That's amazing.
70% of deaths or something.
Yeah,
isn't
my
it?
grandparents each had 11 siblings, and hardly any of them made it out of childhood, right? Whereas today, all of my peers expect their kids to outlive them and to make them all the way through their life. It's amazing. Like childhood mortality statistics have massively decreased in Australia. We've done really well. But what it means is that death now is about old age, is about, for most people, is about, those last 10 years of their life. And it's a thing that, people have started to call, and this is what it's called, prolonged dwindling, right? Prolonged dwindling is how a larger and larger percent of people die.
Gosh, that's a tough term.
It's a tough term, but
I'm thinking about
it's
that.
not a great term, actually.
No,
but
it's kind of wrenched my heart a little bit in my chest hearing that term.
I quite like the verb dwindle. We don't use dwindle enough.
I'm not sure that I like dwindle. I'll think about that. It really makes me think about this idea of the growing care gap. So, we have this enormous five-fold increase in the number of people reaching 85 by about 2031.
Extraordinary.
We have limited residential aged care beds, and, that's not where everybody wants to go. It's the right choice for many at the right time, but most people want to age in place. And then we have the incredible kind of multi-generational care demands that are now falling on the sandwich generation.
And women.
2/3 of which are going to be women. They're going to be probably eldest daughters caring for parents.
Can we have a
in-laws.
moment to talk about eldest daughter phenomenon?
Actually, I'm one of them. Tell me what I need to know.
I'm an only daughter. I have an older brother, but eldest daughter syndrome or eldest daughter phenomenon is like this kind of phenomenon within healthcare and death care where it is kind of this like paraprofessionals who are relied upon to care for their parents, right? Like these are the people that are ferrying their parents to medical appointments and they're the keeper of the binders full of medical information and the organizer of the tests and everything else. Yep. And I think one of the best analyses that I saw of the death doula phenomenon, like the rise of the death doulas, is that they are paid for eldest daughters, right? That this is a group of people whose profession is basically to function how an eldest daughter would, which is to provide non-medical but essential care for people who don't have that kind of support. And yeah, this is why I'm really a strong advocate for community-based models of death care. I think that we need, once you accept that disability and aging are part of everyone's life story, like this is a condition that we all move into and we'll all move out of. But therefore that makes aging and dying a whole community responsibility.
Yeah.
I really agree with that, but then I'm always quite skeptical. I'm always a bit worried because when people say community, I kind of go, well, who in the community?
What does that actually mean? It's a
broad
term.
Who does that mean? And that often means eldest daughters.
Who's typically about 58, according to the research, and because she's still raising kids, they might be late teens or early 20s, but they don't stop needing her just because her parents need her more. They're probably living at home. They're probably living at home because of the
housing crisis,
the cost of living, and a lot of these women are, juggling their own work commitments, career commitments, finances, relationships, somewhere their own messy magic of well-being right in the middle of that sandwich.
Yeah, that little thing.
Yeah.
It's really concerning. And I think there is a lot of unpaid labour that is just totally being taken advantage of within the system because it's plugging the gaps, right? Like this is what we are relying upon. And as you would know, this is something that's only going to become more difficult as we head towards peak death.
Yeah.
Right? So
that was what Ray Martin used, isn't it, in the episode?
Peak death.
Peak death. I've just remembered that.
Yeah. So peak death is a phenomenon that's begun to be talked about in kind of scholarship and academia. And it's just a function of our demographics.
Yeah.
Like if the baby boomer generation, I think this year, the youngest baby boomer has become an older Australian.
Yes.
So 65 plus, or, however the ABS codifies it. And all that just means is that in the next kind of 2 decades or so, we're going to have more people dying than ever before. And that's not necessarily a problem for some parts of our death care system. Like we have probably enough funeral homes. We probably have enough crematoriums. Like some parts of our death care system are going to hold up to that. Other parts of our death care system I'm quite worried about.
Extremely worried about.
Palliative care, aged care,
hospitals.
Dying, hospitals.
And this huge misalignment between what people actually want and how their experience plays out. So there's human cost, but there's enormous economic cost.
Yeah, I mean, and look, as much as I find it kind of slightly distasteful to talk about these things in terms of like productivity for the economy, the average... For every death, I think they say that an average of 9 people are deeply and significantly bereaved to the extent
I've seen that research too.
They need to take leave, right? And that means that is 9 people who are not going to work. Now, our bereavement leave is pretty terrible. I think it's 2 days.
It's terrible. What about our system of grief and loss support is kind of non-existent?
Griefline was just defunded.
Yes. But the need, you've just highlighted 9 people who need support for every one person that dies.
Yeah.
The system is nowhere near that.
And the system is nowhere near that. And it's really challenging and really difficult sometimes to advocate for change in that space, as I'm sure you're very aware.
Yes.
I'm sure you're very aware because partially because I think no one that you talk to knows that this is untrue, but it's that taboo. No one wants to talk about it. No one wants to think about it because they don't like to think about it happening to them. And that's frustrating, but I also feel a lot of compassion for that. That's a very human thing to open the laptop, see the latest headlines on the New York Times and just close the laptop.
It's the radio station you'd rather turn off. Look, I understand, but I also think for where we are in society, we owe it to ourselves, we owe it to our parents and our partners to start to do this better. And I'm not saying for a second that it's going to be easy, but I genuinely believe it can be a lot better than it is today. I think that's the work we have to do. Hey, I'm really interested to talk a little bit more about some of the new rituals you're seeing, particularly around burial. I've seen some amazing work in the States, and I know you're right across that. Give us like the headlines. What are you seeing that are kind of that's emerging in that area?
I think like thinking broadly about both funerals and then also what we might call body disposal, body disposition, how we choose to handle human remains. Probably the biggest, like 2 biggest trends we're seeing is personalisation.
Yeah.
Right? And that is linked to secularisation. People turning away from religious organisations, not necessarily turning away from spirituality, but turning away from kind of the Christian church in many cases, or turning away from like religion.
The service as it was traditionally
done and what it means, what it should be, and being way more creative and hyper-personalised, right? Like, Dad loved fishing. Let's sprinkle his ashes from a fishing boat, whatever it is, or the classic, we're in Australia, the classic footy jersey on the coffin, which has just become so normal these days, but it internationally is just kind of unheard of in many places. So there's a lot of personalisation, and then the other one is
which
a lot
is good.
of it's
right?
great.
That's
It's great.
healthy.
I think I have do what you want to do. I think go out with a bang, right? If you're able to. We always want to make sure that there's possibilities for everyone and they get to do that.
I went to a funeral with my dad just a couple of months ago of a very good friend of his. And so my dad was really emotional on this day. We flew up to Brisbane, like I just needed to be his eldest daughter. Yeah. And his friend who had a cancer diagnosis had completely designed his own funeral.
Love it.
And had chosen the playlist. And so it opened with AC/DC. And
Highway to
honestly,
hell.
in the first like 10 seconds, I was really rattled. I was like, whoa.
Yeah.
But the more I sat with it and I really got a sense of who this man was, and it was beautiful. And I left that service feeling like that really was about that human. That was a tribute to him. It had a personal resonance to who he was. And that's sometimes missing from some of those more prosaic kind of formulaic.
I think there's beauty in both. Like, I think there is something
Yeah, that's
beauty
true.
in the repetition of words that have been repeated over and over and over again, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. I think there's a great comfort that a lot of people find in that. But yeah, I mean, two things on hyper-personalised funerals. One is that one of the greatest stories I've ever heard is of a woman who also designed her own funeral and was a massive Western Bulldogs fan and requested that halfway through the funeral everyone watch the third quarter of the premiership winning game. Really? And they did. Like, everyone in the funeral just, and they're like, and now we're going to show the third quarter of the Western Bulldogs winning the premiership. And, you know, it's kind of ridiculous, but it's what she wanted.
It's what she wanted.
And I think the other thing to say about, like, hyper-personalised funerals or, you know, akadaka and, like, secularization, that sort of thing, is, like, I think it's kind of beautiful how people have been able to make meaning from nothing, right?
Yeah.
That, like, people have been able to say, you know, it doesn't need to be much. It can be a candle lighting, it can be a song, it can be a reading, whatever it is. But we can make it meaningful for that person.
Yeah, and I'm really interested in how that changes those anniversary days over time. So you use that example of fishing. Like, that's a beautiful thing for that family if they can just actually go fishing on their dad's anniversary of his death rather than sit and struggle with that day and not quite know what to do with it.
I will say, like, this is one of the things that religion really does well. Like, religion, for all, you know, people have lots of different views. I'm a religious studies scholar, but religion does these kind of traditions very well. Look at the Catholic Church. It is a time machine. It has passed down the same religious rituals for hundreds and thousands of years. Like, this is, and so it sets up a timeline for your mourning, right? You go back every week, every month, every name day, every death anniversary. And I think so that would be something nice if more secular personalised rituals could do that.
Definitely starting to see that. Really wonder what you're seeing around the role of technology too in that hyper-personalisation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is kind of, I think sometimes we take for face value in Australia that the kind of celebration of life funeral, right? That funeral that you go in, we're probably all familiar. There's a music playlist. And there's a PowerPoint slideshow of photos, right? Like, these are completely normal for an Australian funeral. This is what happens. And then there's a moment they play the sad music and you see photos from their childhood and everyone cries.
And there's usually some really bad party pies or something.
Bad ceremony parties. I'm a big advocate of gourmet food at funerals. This is the one innovation I want to bring in, is that everyone should eat well. But that whole kind of secular funeral model is actually an Aussie invention very much. I know it's like really odd to say, but like until the 1970s, we didn't really have a strong tradition of secular civil celebrants, right? So funerals are mostly led by religious leaders. And long story, but basically our Attorney General at the time, Lionel Murphy, he introduced civil celebrancy for weddings. So all of a sudden you didn't have to get married either at a church or at birth, deaths and marriages. You could get married by anyone who was registered. And one of the people who was registered, the first person he appointed as a civil celebrant, was a young woman. She was, I think, 26 or something at the time. And all of a sudden, this kind of ritual power in our society that had been invested only in, like, ordained men was invested in her. And then, like, you know, Lionel Murphy's a kind of an interesting radical reformist. And, you know, he also made a lot of Indigenous Australians civil celebrants. And
It started with wedding.
It started with
celebration,
wedding,
then it started to branched out into
funerals, and then from those funerals, Daly Messenger and others, these kind of celebrants in Australia, like the celebrant, the idea of a celebrant, is in many ways like a product of 1970s, 80s, 90s Australia, and that was exported around the world. Like, there's a very famous Time magazine article, you know, in the States, being like, "Look what the Australians are doing. They're having lay people conduct their rituals," right? And so this is so common for us that we go to a funeral and this is kind of what I expect. I expect there will be some eulogies, some music, a slideshow and a bad party pie. I
didn't realise that the movement started here.
It started here, and it's And I think it is a real great example of that kind of secular personalization, creative death ritual that we're doing. We've exported it around the world.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then we've got, the more extreme and more recent technology examples that are coming up with AI, where you can have a chat with your dead father,
Which is great and terrifying.
It is. It's somewhere in. I mean, I don't really have my head wrapped around it, to be honest. I can understand how it may bring solace to some people, but I also can't see the end of it, so I can't kind of contain it in a way that makes sense in my head.
I think it's one of those things that it's, people always tend to ask me for, like, or is this good for people? Or is this bad for people? And I'm like, what? That's such a simplification of.
Yeah.
Of,
it's not that binary.
It's not that binary. Like, is this good for grief? Is anything good for grief? Grief is pretty complicated. And I don't think you can say that you're doing grief well or poorly. Like, grief is something that happens and you're in it.
And to hear someone's voice after they've died, whether that's going back to a phone message they left you or a video.
People have been doing that for ages.
That's precious. And
absolutely.
And so this is really just a kind of progression of that. But the thing I can't really come to terms with is, where does it end? How do you manage that in a safe way?
I think a lot of it, as with all kind of AI and kind of technology, for me, always comes down to these questions of, like, well, access and availability. And, who gets to have that? Yeah. Who gets to access that? How long? Who controls it? Who owns the information? There's a lot of kind of famous cases of kind of what we call almost like dead necrotech, dead death tech.
Necrotech?
Dead death tech.
Gosh.
So, like, all of these
I've heard that before.
So all of these companies that have kind of, there's classic ones, like all these companies that said, upload all of your loved one's data to our server. And we will create a chatbot,
an avatar,
a web page, a memorial page, that we will keep them alive forever. And then the companies go bust and they close down and the website's no longer accessible. And so you have almost a second death, right? That,
Or it could be subject to some kind of security breach.
Well,
and
this is like 23andMe.
Your dad's avatar could, exactly.
I feel very confident my decision many years ago never to do a DNA test, because I was like, I don't know who's that, where that data's going. But, this is also a concern with death tech. So, I think there are many kind of creative, exciting possibilities for it. But I also do really worry about, as with all of these things with technology, the equity, the access, the cost.
Also, but it's, on the same hand, it's one of the most democratized pieces of technology in many respects.
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, I have seen the one kind of extraordinarily compelling use of it, this technology in particular, that I've seen is the Holocaust Museum internationally, but also here in Australia in the Sydney Powerhouse Museum. And they did oral history recordings with survivors of the Holocaust and asked them to record their stories, but also then using AI kind of created these holograms of people that visitors could then go to and ask questions and interact with and learn from. And obviously that's very controlled, it's very safe. Like, we're not, because obviously there's a lot of kind of potential to do harm to that legacy as well.
Yes.
But given how important those survivors' stories are, and, how old they are now and how few of them are still alive, that is a kind of...
great example.
It's a great example of how it can go really well. Of course, it could also go really poorly.
I know.
It's a bit of a catch.
Yeah, and we're still just in that figuring out space, aren't we? One of the things I am really enjoying seeing with the emergence of AI and tech in this space is just how sophisticated this idea of empathetic AI is becoming, that it can now... could be having a conversation with us and recognising that Melissa's getting distressed or sad or has stopped talking, and adjusting and checking in a different way and reframing a question. I mean, they're really sophisticated tools.
I tend to be on the kind of slightly more terrified, uncanny side of the coin. That's just because I'm slightly terrified, uncanny of all new technology. I'm just skeptical of all new technology, and that's fine. But I think there are certainly some beautiful examples of it being used, and it's never as simple as yes or no, right?
It's not. It's going to get more complex.
It's going to get more and more complex. I just hope that when we kind of go down that road and develop that path, we kind of remember also like the shared humanity of like what we're doing and like what it means to be a mortal human being. And I think that I hope that it is used for death acceptance and not death denial, I suppose. That would be like kind of the moral concern is like, if you can just log in and talk to your deceased child every day for 50 years, why would you want to stop?
And therein lies the complexity. That's a nice way to get me to a question that I'm really keen to ask you. 'Cause I've heard you say before that death isn't a moment, it's a process. If you had the chance to redesign how we approach this, where is the place that you would start? What would be the piece that we could kind of identify and pick off and work on? Given all your experience, what would that be?
There are so many things. Like, I'm going to throw out like 5 starting points and then I'll go with what it could be like, I would make a public death care option. I would have funeral arrangements and end-of-life hospice care as part of Medicare in Australia. I think it's ridiculous that if we don't have money, you can't access these kind of things. I would regulate the funeral sector better. I would, all of these different things. But actually in the last couple of years, having moved from someone who researches death and dying and writes about death and dying to now somebody who teaches death and dying, I actually think the starting point is to bring comprehensive death education into secondary schools.
Right.
I know that's a big swing, but
outside of a religious paradigm, which is how it would have traditionally come up in the classroom.
It just doesn't come up in the classroom at all. And I think part of it is because we have this presumption that children can't think about death, or teenagers, or, university students, whatever stage of education we put that into.
I love Maggie Dent's advice on this. She said if you've got kids, you've got to buy guinea pigs. And you've got to keep buying them because you'll probably have like 5, 6 or 7 guinea pigs die.
Yeah, my guinea pigs in childhood died because they were afraid of thunder. Like, guinea pigs die really easily.
I think that's her point, exposing kids to the cycle of life and death.
And kids are like extraordinarily resilient. But I think that having taught so many young people now about death and dying, they're so much better than we are. Like, they're really good and they want to know about death and they're interested and they're reflexive and they want to do it better and they want to do it differently. And I think that, there's lots of different starting points, things that I would change, conversations I would start, healthcare and aging and dying. But in terms of like broad cultural generational change, I think it has to be kind of conversations as part of our education system.
Yeah, wow, okay.
Now,
I think that's a great answer.
That looks like a task.
Here's the next step in that question, because I think that's a very good answer, but is a long way away from realising change, just because of the age and the kind of early career stage of those people. Given that we have got this 5-fold increase in people reaching 85 and we've got 5 million sandwich generation carers, what's the one thing that you would want to put on the table for where we're at today?
Why would you stump me like that? What is the one thing? I would probably try and just make a really small but significant and quite costly intervention in our carer and bereavement leave system.
Which is currently 2 days.
I would just try and give people more time.
Yeah.
I would just...
It seems like I know there's a huge economic tag attached to that, but in terms of making it possible...
I'm not sure there is.
Yeah, when you think about the cost of presenteeism and absenteeism, the cost is already there.
I would just kind of say objectively, we all know that 2 days is ridiculous. Let's make it a week. Let's make it 2 weeks. Most people are probably not going to take it, right? Like, we know, like, people, workplaces, all this kind of thing. I just would try and relieve some of that pressure and burden off working women in the sandwich generation in particular. In the same way that we've introduced domestic violence leave, or we've introduced all these different kinds of leave. I think it's a small thing, but I think it would also signal that our welfare system is interested not just in life, but also in death.
Yes, and recognises the role of caregiving.
And recognises the role of
caregiving.
Stage.
Just a small shout out to corporate Australia.
Just a small shout out to Department of Health and corporate Australia. Men, just a small shout out to men. Eldest sons also could, younger sons, everyone could be part of this more. Because, I think whether we like it or not, it's something we're all going to realise pretty soon in the next couple of years and decades in Australia. So we should get ahead of it.
Thank you for coming in and sharing all of that.
Thank you.
With me. I have learnt so much, including the fact that necrotech is a thing and a term. Great to talk with you, Hannah.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.